All right. Well, welcome. Welcome to our seventh episode of Data Talks, a series of free 45-minute webinars about using local data to inform housing policy. My name is Claudia Aiken. I'm Director of New Research Partnerships at the Housing Solutions Lab. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Patrick Spauster, who is our data fellow here at the NYU Furman Center. And we're really excited for our discussion, which will focus on storytelling with data, and particularly communicating data in ways that are accessible and impactful, especially for communities that are sometimes left out of housing policy decisions. I'm really delighted to welcome two guests today. Allison De Marco, who is Advanced Research Scientist at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at UNC, and Donna Carrington, Executive Director of the Community Empowerment Fund, who are going to share with us their firsthand experience leading a couple of data walks in Chapel Hill and Durham, North Carolina. So great to have you, Donna and Allison. Next slide. I'm going to start it off today with just a very brief introduction to the Housing Solutions Lab and to this series. Then I'll hand it off to Patrick to lead us through a presentation about data storytelling best practices and approaches. And then we'll have a conversation with Allison and Donna to learn more about their experience. And finally, we will have 10 to 15 minutes for your questions. So please feel free to submit those via the Q&A function at any time during the session, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Next slide. So if you're not familiar with the Housing Solutions Lab, we are based at the NYU Furman Center, and our mission is to help small and mid-sized cities plan, launch, and evaluate housing policies with the goal of advancing racial equity, health, and well-being. Next slide. I hope that you will take the opportunity to view past episodes on our website and register for upcoming ones. Each of these sessions will feature a fireside chat with someone like Allison or Donna who has that on-the-ground experience, and we'll post some recommended reading to go along with each episode as well. So I'll drop the link to that in the chat in just a moment. But now I will go ahead and pass things over to Patrick.
Great. Thanks so much, Claudia. I'm Patrick Spauster. I'm the data fellow at the Furman Center. I also teach a course for urban planners on storytelling with data, and I'm a journalist as well. So you'll kind of see some of those experiences peppered through some of my suggestions here when it comes to data storytelling. And I'm really excited to hear from our panel today about getting into the weeds of doing some data storytelling on the ground, but for purposes of this, I'm going to kind of present some high-level takeaways for storytelling with data and how you can use it in your work, and some of the kind of the principles that I rely on in order to tell an effective story that meets the needs of my audience. Starting with that, I always start with the purpose. Whenever you're doing a research project or a data storytelling, I'm always thinking about what is the purpose of my project as kind of my North Star. Why am I doing this research and why does it matter? Right, your purpose and your data story, what you decide to include in that data story, what audiences you want to target are all going to be informed by that purpose, right? Am I trying to advance a more equitable policy solution? Who are the people that I need to reach to support this? Who are the decision makers that I need to target that might be able to make the changes that I want to see? Right, and anyone that's worked on a research question or a research project before knows that in order to get down to data, you need to kind of get to some research questions, right? You start with a purpose, you start with a problem, you identify something you want to change or you want to study, and then you have to develop a research question that's connected to that purpose. And right, importantly, when you're using data, you try to figure out how can you get data that answers that research question. How can I create a data question that I can answer with some quantitative data or some visualization? But I think one thing I always like to emphasize when it comes to researching something or telling a data story is that this is an iterative process, right? You can start with a big idea, define your purpose, and then go look for data, but there's inevitably going to be complications along the way. Maybe the data that you have doesn't quite speak to the issue that you have, and you need to supplement it with other things, right? Like, who can I talk to? Can I do some interviews? Are there community members that might know where to look for this? Do I need to kind of tweak the scope of my research questions and my purpose in order to align with the available data or what I'm hearing from folks about the direction that this research needs to go to kind of best be able to empower and answer some of the policy questions that I might have. Right. So I think that that's just important to keep in mind that this is going to change along the way. And that's going to affect the type of story that you want to tell. So to get to the punch, data storytelling, I define it pretty simply as kind of applying methods of human communication to help an audience develop a connection to information. Right. So I think the key word in that definition is audience. And so I think importantly, thinking about who is affected by this issue. That audience that you identify is going to inform so much of what you actually end up putting into your data story versus what might be kind of more in the background as part of like your research project process or the steps that you took along the way. So a couple of guiding questions that I like to start with that I ask myself, and I also like to ask your audience. I think like through a data walk is a great way to kind of to ask some of these questions. Is what is interesting about this analysis, this data, or this research question? What is surprising or not surprising about my results? And what implications do these results have for the real world? These are going to kind of help you identify the key points of your research that you want to pull out and turn into a data story that you want to present to your audiences to keep their attention on what's interesting and important and enable you to make the most impact with the story that you're telling. So once I've kind of molded some of these questions, I really do think about a data story as a story, right? And every story has an arc. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. And I kind of think about trying to map the research process onto this story map, right? So you can begin with providing the context and background, introduce the problem and the questions. These are like kind of informed by the research purpose that I mentioned, and then kind of sprinkle in maybe some of what you did, but really landing on the findings of this is what we found, this is why we think it's important. Interpreting it, what does it mean for the people that are affected by this issue, and where should we go from here? Right, so these are those six steps again. You can think about the research process. One thing that if you're a little bit more journalistically inclined like me, one thing that I think is really effective is also just giving a little bit of a sprinkle of your findings early on, right? Like when you're presenting the context and the background and the problem and the research questions, saying, okay, this is what we found, is a great way to make sure that your audience knows that what's coming is worth staying for, right? People's attention is often very split, and to the extent you can hook them early and show them that what you're doing is going to be worthwhile is going to be a super important part of making sure that you're telling an effective story. Right, and you can kind of map the beginning, middle, and end onto these again. And I think one thing that I'm constantly thinking about, which is really informed by these questions of audience, who and why, is kind of which of these you choose to emphasize and which and is going to be upfront in a data story versus which can kind of sink into the backdrop. I kind of think about it like a curtain about like what you want front and center in your data story and what can kind of sit in the back. So to give an example, I find that including your findings and the implications is like are some of the most important parts of your data story. That's how you're going to make an impact. Whereas the research methods, I think, can often be simplified down to like a sentence or two if it's a written product, or keeping it short and brief to kind of prove the merits of what you've done and that you've done your homework on whatever issue that you're talking about, but not bogging down too much in it so that you can make sure that your audience stays engaged. And keep, right, like obviously that doesn't mean don't do sophisticated research methods or don't keep track of what you did, but just maybe save it for a more sophisticated or like curious person that wants to ask more and follow up. It doesn't need to be kind of front and center in your data story. You're also inevitably going to be visualizing some things, and I could do a whole another talk on visualization, but I'll just maybe present some of the three tips that I find most effective in some of the visualization work that I'm doing. And here I've kind of provided an example. But making things easy for your audience is the number one thing. You want to kind of like make it as comprehensible as possible. And part of that I find is including takeaway titles and direct labels and making sure that you have graphics that can kind of stand alone and have one key takeaway. So to give an example, using this chart that I made recently, I was looking at CityFEP's housing vouchers in New York City, and I am looking at the locations of where they were used. So I had a pretty clear takeaway here once I had put this on a map, which was that CityFEP's vouchers were only used in a few zip codes. Right, they were extremely concentrated in the Bronx here and in Southeast Brooklyn. And for those of you that might know a little bit about New York, these are places with more concentrated poverty in New York City. And that has important policy implications, right? If voucher holders are only able to use their vouchers in these neighborhoods, they're not able to access some of the so-called higher opportunity neighborhoods that might be around the city that might have more resources, better schools, or that sort of thing. I was using the takeaway title here to emphasize the concentration, right? Like these vouchers were most used in just a few zip codes. I've kept the kind of what you often see as a title for a chart, the like kind of description of the data that you're looking at, the total CityFEP's payments by zip code in September 2024, right? That is often what you see as the title. I've kind of made that the subtitle here so that I can really hit home that key takeaway. And then I've also used direct annotation to really draw the viewer's eye to the specific thing that I'm talking about. So here I've used a circle and an arrow to specifically draw the reader's attention to the Bronx, which is one of these concentrated areas that I mentioned. And I've included another statistic that I think kind of helps back up my point, which is that the Bronx has 16% of the city's population, but 46% of the city's voucher holders. And that naturally leads to the question about why they are so concentrated and why they're not as evenly distributed as they might be as the population of the city as a whole. And I think that this works well, this approach, because, right, like an image is 1,000 words or whatever, but also, right, like if you can kind of capture an issue in a graphic, using the title, using annotations to your benefit, it also stands alone so that if someone wanted to share just this graphic, they could get a pretty good idea about what's going on with these vouchers. To wrap up a little bit, I think some bigger principles for data storytelling. Understanding your audience and their perspective here is going to be super important. Are you talking to community members? Are you trying to target policymakers and what's important to them? And then once you understand that, providing the fitting context and background information that's calibrated to that audience. Those different audiences might need different background information and different quantities of background information in order to trust you, to engage, and to really hear your key takeaways. Right, offering ways to connect and relate to the information presented. A data walk is a great idea, so a great way to do that. So I won't linger on that too much, but creating that narrative that flows will help keep your readers or your listeners engaged as you present your important findings. And why tell a story at all? I think this is like a cheesy line that I've stolen from Robert Caro, but all that matters is on the page, which is just to say, like, when you're doing that exercise of like what needs to go in front of this curtain and what I can keep behind it, keep in mind that your audience is really going to remember everything that you put in front of them and that you engage with them. And you don't want to lose them by putting out information that they might not be interested in. But you also need to make sure that what you're presenting or writing is the most important thing so that you can meet your audience exactly where they're at. What information do they need to be able to make a decision? But I think some added benefits of doing a data story are that people are, even folks that don't have extensive experience with like a research process, can still understand and critique a story, which can help you check your assumptions, right? Like if I'm assuming that it's this way and I'm creating a story that describes that, folks are really good about saying, okay, well, that surprised me. I didn't think that was going to be the case. And that can help you kind of hone in on some of the assumptions that you've made, maybe check them and craft a story that's going to speak to all of those possibilities. And then I think my final tip or suggestion is you can think about data storytelling as a persuasive exercise, and it's not just happening when you're presenting something or when you're writing something. Right? I think you most often think about data storytelling perhaps when you're producing a written product or a presentation. But I feel as though I'm doing data storytelling all day, every day, in my work when it's something as simple as like my boss asks me for numbers about something that we're working on. I'm like telling a mini data story in a meeting when I'm saying, oh, well, this is what the indicator that we're looking at says, and here's what I think it means for what we should do as an organization, as a city, or as people trying to influence policy. So I would encourage you to think about it not just in the limited sense of I'm doing a presentation or a blog post or an article or a brief or a research report, but you can really start to use it in your work outside of that. And that's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I'm also already seeing good questions in the Q&A. So folks, please keep putting those in there. For the next portion, we'll have a conversation with our guests, Allison and Donna, about a couple of data walks that they did in Durham and Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So Donna, I'd like to start it off with you, if I may. Could you tell me just a little bit about your recent study investigating disparities in housing stability in Chapel Hill and Durham, and what really motivated that?
So, we are an organization that works with unhoused and housed people that are in financial instability. And we decided that we have a very rich community that has a lot of data that would probably be good to drive housing policy or for us to really think about how we want to show up as our community. So Allison and I have known each other for years. My finance and operations director had been looking around for research projects for us to do and came across this one with the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation. Talked to me, said, hey, I think we should do this. Who do you know? I said, well, I know Allison, but we also needed a third PI, who is Danielle Spurlock, who does urban planning. Because what we really wanted to talk about was how systemic racism shows up in urban planning, how it shows up in healthcare, how it shows up in housing in our community. And that's really important to me because these are the statistics and the data that drive why our community is proceeding in the way that it's proceeding.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And Allison, if I can follow up with you, what did that study find?
So I was really appreciating what Patrick was sharing because we were thinking a lot about how to visualize some of the work that we're doing, and I know we'll share more about that in a little bit. But one of the things that we put together that I think was eye-catching for folks was this timeline of housing and homelessness and structural racism, kind of nationally, a national picture, but also locally too. And so we're able to use that to really look at like what is the underlying foundations in our own community of why it looks the way it does now. And so Durham is a historically redlined community. Chapel Hill was smaller. It wasn't historically redlined, but you see very similar patterns of development and investment in the two communities. So we had created kind of a timeline that was overlaid with Durham's redlining map, historic redlining map, just to kind of tell that story and to share. So one of the things that we really wanted to do all throughout this project was really to highlight, center, let lead the folks who are having these experiences. So one of the primary things we did is collected a fair amount of qualitative data where we just spent some time talking to folks about what their experiences had been. And we were fortunate that CEF already has something akin to a community advisory board. So in Chapel Hill, it's called Meeting of the Minds. And in Durham, Donna.
It's also called Meeting of the Minds now. They're just delineated by geography.
So we're able to, they meet monthly, so we're able to go and, well, really just learn from them, but also like ask them what questions we should ask. And so one of the questions that just kind of came up and then they shared too was what it really means to be stably housed. And some of just what that group shared was so powerful, about finally taking their camping equipment out of their car, not thinking about how you arrange a car to live in, was really powerful. And so that was one of the primary questions we asked folks, and just so like really grounding in understanding why this work is so important, why what Donna does is so important, why us sharing what we learned is so important. Yeah. And then also thinking about how you visually display qualitative work that's interesting and engaging. Yeah. So I just really appreciated thinking about more about what they said and shared with us. And things too, like I think we think more of like the financial security, but someone shared something like, I can pursue my hobbies now that I have a stable place to live. I'm like, yes, everyone needs outlets for creative energy and self-care and growth. So that's, we heard a fair amount about that. And then we also asked them about what kind of things they really appreciated with CF. CF is very relationship-based. It's really about working alongside community members, and Donna can talk more about that model, but a lot of appreciation of that approach. And then also some elucidation of some of the political or the policy barriers that folks are facing as they try to get housing. And so one thing that came up a number of times was you now have to have 3 times the rent to qualify for some of these housing, which is a huge barrier when you think about what incomes are like. And that just helped us then be able to share with policymakers and be like, do you realize what this means?
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think Donna and I could keep talking about that, but I think we want to move on and talk about some other things.
Exactly. So, I mean, definitely a clear theme here is centering the people who are closest to the issue in this project, and you carried that through all the way to dissemination of your findings. And I'd love to hear more about your choice to conduct these data walks and maybe also just help us understand what is a data walk and what is it meant to do.
So I thought I'd kick that off and then Donna can pitch in and we're going to kind of tag team like that. So literally it's displaying data that folks walk around or move around as they're able. So I've had experiences participating in some of them, but had never created our own. So I reached out to some colleagues who do work across the country and had done this with parents and caregivers and other staff, and really liked some of the ideas they had about how you can engage folks in the data. So, I mean, literally it's big posters of your data that are engaging and interesting looking, jargon free. And then they helped us think of ways to really get folks to look at the data. So they do things, and we implemented this to a certain extent, like scavenger hunts. Like they had a little booklet and they're like, go find the poster and answer this question. So there were some things like that to really get folks to like, actually look at this poster, and then think about like what the takeaways are. So then we had a series of guiding questions. So I think we had like 14 to 15 posters. A little over half of them were this qualitative data. And then the other half were more quantitative data around home prices and how that's changed over time in some of these communities, kind of looking at kind of a redlined community or lower resource community versus some of these communities that have never seen disinvestment, and then shared with that. And then we just asked folks to think about what surprises you, what interests you, and then really think about ideas for action. So we also wanted to make sure we were action oriented with our data walk and thinking about what needs to change, what needs to be different. Yeah. So I'll stop talking.
Yeah, and it was important to us to do two data walks because the communities are actually pretty different, and we thought that the communities would receive the data very differently. So when we did the one in at our Chapel Hill office, we figured that probably who was going to be the audience that was going to be come out was going to be some of the community that answered the question, but probably would be more of our people on town council and county commissioners and things like that. In Durham, what ended up coming out interestingly were other organizations that had people proximate to probably more of the people that we asked the questions about for the data walk. So it may have been their first time learning about CEF or any of the issues that were talked about in the data walk. And so that was a very different response than what we got in Orange County. But it was important because the counties actually show up very differently in how people engage and how people would receive that data.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So knowing your audience is
Yep.
very important. Um, so next I'd love to just hear a little bit about how it went. Who came? You've spoken to that a little bit, but also how did your audience kind of engage with the data? Um, and how do you think the data walks actually affected your audience?
I will say that I think the way the audience seemed to engage to me was very reflective. They talked about, some of this we knew, but seeing it on this actual poster in conjunction with these other data points, had people's mind thinking, probably in a different way than they get presented data in other ways. There also were around other people to where they could talk about it and ask questions about it. Leave sticky notes about, hey, I saw this thing. That's very interesting to me because it may not have been something that they ever thought of. So yeah, we saw a lot of reflection. We saw a lot of head nodding, a lot of, yeah, we know these kind of things, but also we don't know these kind of things. Um, I think it was impressed upon them that the reflection of this data was by people that are very much experiencing the issues on the ground. And so that I think that also was really helpful for people to understand that this wasn't like high level people making an assumption about what they think they see. This was actual people answering questions about the experiences that they're having and us being able to display that as data points. So I think that was a lot. Um, I think our audience was, like I said, reflective, but also I think it felt like it was a lot to try to tackle because all of the things were so interwoven. It's like, where do you start? And so I think I've seen some of that coming from people that have been at the data walk. But also, interestingly, in Durham, I think what happened was some of the organizations that were there decided to connect with us more because they may have been dealing with one part of the issue. We're dealing with the housing part of the issue. They're dealing with the workforce part of the issue and really wanting to be in connection more because it's all part of a system. And so I think that will help inform us more about how we as an organization are able to connect to people, like making sure that there is this continuum of partnerships around some of the data points to really do some work in this community.
That's great. Yeah, let me ask one more question before we
Sure.
turn it over to our audience. I'd love to know what did you learn? What lessons did you learn? Would you do it differently next time? What advice would you give to other places interested in engaging the community in this way?
Thanks for
Um,
asking. I'm sorry,
yeah,
Donna.
go ahead, Al. No, you go ahead.
Okay. Claudia, I appreciate this question because it really went into how we designed our sessions. So I've been to sessions where it's very formal and there's small groups at each poster and you move around with that group. And we really, since it was open to a lot of different folks, we wanted to make sure to do as much as we could to minimize the power dynamics. So we didn't have someone who was having, like, currently in crisis there standing with the mayor, just to make that feel more inclusive and less scary, I think. So we wanted to make sure it was just drop in. Folks could come and go as they wanted. We had folks there. We engaged our master's in social work students who helped us a lot with the project. So it was neat for them to be able to be there to answer questions, but also just to hear and listen and see the fruits of their labor. We did them outside for COVID precautions just to be safe. And so a lesson learned for me would be think about the wind. So
Yes. Yes.
the one at Chapel Hill, we kept running and grabbing posters. And then in Durham, it was beautiful and it was totally fine. Yeah. So thinking about that, like, should we have somehow affixed them to the wall or something, or, you know, figured out something. So yeah. And like in hindsight, with I think more time and capacity, I would have liked to do more of them and maybe break down participants and had maybe some different groups. And then also had some time. So we've talked about this now a little bit because folks are really interested in this idea. And someone asked, could that be data? Yes, obviously. What people then share at the data walk is data. And I would have loved, and we still probably could, do some listening sessions. Like, now that you've seen this, like, have some more deep conversations about what they learn and what actions we can take.
I love that. Donna, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that I agree with what Allison said. I think definitely having more pointed groups that we could do more of this with would have been really good. Um, and thinking about um, our policymakers being one group, but also local organizations and what they're seeing, and having participants really be able to see more of the participants be able to see the data and talk about what the data is, um, would be really important. I will say that as a person that's not a researcher, this was a very new experience for me. Um, but the visualizations, I think, really hit home about the data points, and I thought that was really important. I thought the languaging was really important. It was accessible to everyone. I think if you're going to do something like this, you have to make sure that it's accessible to all people, or who actually is your audience and who are you really trying to get this out to.
Yep. Yeah. Well, we're getting some great questions. I want to start off with a comment, not a question. Amara says, I'm a social worker, and I love that you all considered those power dynamics and were so thoughtful in your approach. My social worker heart is glowing. My heart's glowing too.
Allison will love that.
So we got a great question, I think, from Emma. She's curious about some strategies for or examples of sharing qualitative data in a way that's visually engaging. And since I know you guys had to tackle that, would love to hear your thoughts.
So I had the good fortune to attend a doctoral dissertation defense that was a mixed method study. And so I really liked the way she had presented her data that was both, it was kind of summary and then the actual words of the participants with some, not a lot, but a few visuals. So we really modeled it on that, where we had like, what was the question, what were the key themes, and then the actual words of participants. And then also, of course, trying not to be too dense on one slide, right? Yes, so definitely always defaulting to more words of what people actually shared. Being
Yep.
as jargon-free as possible, no acronyms.
Yep. That's great. I think this question might be for you, Patrick. Juan wants to know, um, sometimes you have kind of a massive database and it's difficult to know where to begin defining what are the stories, and it can be easy to get lost. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations when facing that kind of challenge?
Yeah, this is such a good question. I kind of have two answers. One of them is like more general, and then one of them is a more technical. For the first answer is I think this is a great opportunity to engage people. Right? If you have a data set and you don't know what the story is, if you can figure out who like might be affected by this data set, if it's a data set about people or communities, like talking to those people, and trying to figure out what stories they want to see in the data, what they suspect might be there, and then kind of using the data set to analyze those theories and test them. I think that's just a great opportunity to bring in people that know and have experience with the issue that you're talking about. But I think just generally speaking, when you're looking at a data set, I think there are also just like some probing questions that I almost always ask it, which are things like, um, what is the like, right, has this changed over time? Like, to use the vouchers example, like, are people living in the same neighborhoods as they were a couple years ago? You can do like the composition of it, like who are voucher holders, like what types of people are they? The distribution, where are they? That's kind of the question that I answered. Or a comparison, right? Like, what does it look like in New York City compared to other places? Those are the types of kind of data questions that I lean on as like foundational ones that I feel like are generally applicable in a lot of different situations and can kind of reveal some of those trends or interesting stories or insights that might pop and might resonate with your audience.
I just want to quickly back up what Patrick just said, because I have another project where we have a lot of longitudinal data, and we're getting ready to go down to the communities and say, look at all we have learned. How can we use this to benefit you? Like how can we analyze this differently, or how can we display it differently, or how can we ask new questions? Yeah. So yeah, appreciate that.
Great. We've got a couple like very practical questions, Allison and Donna, about how you all actually collected the qualitative data, and then also how you did outreach for the data walks. How did you get people to come? Who wants
Um,
to go first, Donna?
yeah, I'll go first about the outreach. So, the thing about this area is people are very curious. And when you say things like data walks or dissemination of information, people are going to want to come. We did your standard stuff. We made sure it was on locations of where people could come and go. We had food. You can get people to do a lot of things for food, like for that to be there. Um, so I think, making sure that if you really want people to come, that it's going to be set up in a way that allows for them to come. Also, it being in our parking lot where people had a lot of space to move around, especially with the COVID precautions, thinking about, people being able to have the space to move around to each of the different displays without feeling like there's 50 people on them. So actually being able to do the walk and absorb the information. So placing of things makes a big deal.
And I can do the data collection question pretty quickly. It was a Qualtrics survey in which we offered folks whatever works best for them. So if they wanted us to interview them, we were available, particularly our MSW interns were available in the offices at CEF. And some folks opted to do that. And then folks could do it online. They could get a hard copy. Yeah, and a lot of folks opted just to do it on the Qualtrics survey.
That's really cool. I
Oh.
love that you had that many options. I think that's pretty rare. We've got a question from Kayla that I think is interesting. She wants to know if you used any type of hybrid approach. So, for example, surveys or things for people participating in the data walk that didn't want to necessarily provide feedback in person or in a group setting. Um, and if you thought about that or did that, how did it go?
This is a good question and something that we thought about. So we definitely invited folks to, if they couldn't come, to share information with us. We have a policy brief that has not all the information, but the brief has a lot of information that we can share with folks, because we did have a number of folks that couldn't come and they wanted to know how else they might learn about the study. There were spots that they could share anonymously, just jot ideas down on Post-it notes and share that. Yeah, but I like this question. It's good for us to think on.
Yeah, another question actually comes from my colleague, Tony. He's interested in maybe actually engaging the community in doing the data storytelling, I think, if I'm interpreting his question correctly. So he says, I've done some activities with students that get them working with numbers and maps, but oftentimes there are big differences in the skill level or the interest. So I think he'd be curious to know how you approach those kind of different levels of comfort with data.
I think the plain languaging, I think the visualizations really help to make sure that it can be accessible for everyone. I think the ability for us to get feedback about whether this feels accessible is always helpful with a broader community.
Yes. All right, well, we're almost at the end here. I do have one question for you, Patrick, which I know you said you could spend a whole nother presentation talking about this. But we do have someone really interested in some of your tips around visualization specifically. Are there any resources you could point her towards or things that you would say off the top of your mind?
Oh boy. I think the best way to learn about visualizations is really to find visualizations that work for you and kind of shamelessly copy people. Like honestly, like people are really good at this. I definitely learned a lot of this from like folks I worked with at the Urban Institute who have done a lot of data walks, and was like, okay, that's a really good chart. I like what they did there, and kind of building it on it and like applying it to your own issue. So I think like some good places to look for that could be in the research world, but I think also just like broadly in the social services world when you're seeing charts and visuals that you like. I think that can be really effective. And then I think I've learned a lot from just like I'm more like news-oriented visualizations, right? I think like some of the principles that I talked about are definitely stolen from that about, right? Like let's have a clear takeaway title and a direct annotation. Like those are things that I've definitely learned from finding visualizations in the news that I think are really compelling and like really to the point. And I think that that can really help as well.
I was just
Great.
reflecting on presentations I've been to that have regression formulas in them.
Yeah.
And I also second what Patrick said about some of the materials the Urban Institute has put out. We had is it Michael Swabish, Patrick?
John, I think John Travis.
John, yeah. He came and did a visualization session for the project that Donna was talking for, Robert Wood Johnson funded project that funded our project about that, and really has some great tips to really have more equitable, not only clear, but also equitable visualization techniques.
Well, we are at time. Thank you so much, Donna, Allison, Patrick. I think this has been a wonderful conversation. Folks, I'm so sorry if we didn't get to your question. Reach out to me, and we'll see if we can get it answered. We will post a recording of this to our website and to YouTube, and we'll try to share it as widely as we can. So look out for that and look out for future episodes as well. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you all. Take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you.